Welcome to one of the most chilling cases ever recorded in Oklahoma history. Before we dive in, drop a comment telling us where you're tuning in from and the exact time you're listening. It's always fascinating to see where these stories reach and at what hour they're being heard. In the summer of 1921, the disappearance of the Ashcroft Sisters shook the quiet community of Elmore County to its core. What began as a simple missing persons report spiraled into one of the most unsettling mysteries the state has ever known. The official accounts only scratch the surface, while the rest of the truth lingers in scattered documents, faded memories, and stories people tried hard to forget. On June 17th, Eleanor and Margaret Ashcroft were last seen walking the edge of their family's property on the outskirts of Riverbrook, a small and unremarkable town with a few wooden storefronts, a post office, and scattered homes tucked between rolling hills and heavy woods. Their home stood apart from it all, a Victorian farmhouse built in 1887 on 15 acres beside Blackwater Creek. According to reports filed 2 days later, the sisters had gone out for their usual evening walk, but never returned for supper. Their father, Dr. Thomas Ashcroft, Riverbrook's only physician and a respected figure in town, searched the grounds himself before calling on neighbors. By nightfall, a search party had scoured the area with no trace of the girls. The search lasted 3 weeks before being abandoned, leaving the town haunted with unanswered questions. What makes this case so unsettling isn't just the disappearance itself, but the strange behavior of the family in the months before the contradictions in witness statements and a shocking discovery made in 1967 that forced people to reconsider everything they thought they knew. Much of what follows has been pieced together from fragments, newspaper clippings, from the Riverbrook Gazette police reports, private letters that surfaced decades later, and interviews with aging residents recorded in 1962 by historian Dr. James Holloway for his unpublished work, Forgotten Tragedies of Rural Oklahoma. The Ashcrofts had lived in Riverbrook since 1914, when Thomas moved his practice from Tulsa. His wife Virginia was known as polite but distant, while Eleanor, 28, and Margaret, 26, remained at home to care for their ailing mother, a situation that fueled whispers in town. Their property was isolated, shielded by thick elm trees, with the nearest neighbors a mile away. Visitors were rare, though Thomas's position ensured he was constantly needed. Yet in the months before the disappearance, people noticed changes. Virginia, who once occasionally attended church, stopped going entirely. Thomas began closing his practice early on certain days without explanation. And perhaps most striking of all the sisters, who were once often seen running errands or borrowing books from the tiny library, became almost invisible, retreating into a silence that no one could quite explain. Meredith Wilson, whose family lived next door to the Ashcrofts, told Dr. Holloway in 1962 that something about that household shifted in March of 1921. She recalled how the curtains were always drawn, how Dr. Ashcroft stopped acknowledging neighbors when he drove past, and how the sisters themselves seemed to fade before her eyes. Once lively and full of spirit, they appeared to age years in just weeks, Eleanor most of all. Meredith remembered seeing her at the general store shortly before the disappearance, and the confident young woman she once knew could not even bring herself to meet her gaze. The day the sisters vanished was unusually hot, with temperatures reaching 92 degrees. In his statement to Sheriff Miller Dursun, Ashcroft claimed he had been in town treating a pneumonia case and returned around 6:30 that evening to find his wife asleep and no sign of his daughters. He explained that they often walked along Blackwater Creek and assumed they had simply lost track of time. But when night fell, he grew uneasy. By nearly 10 o'clock, he was at the Wilson home asking if anyone had seen them. The first searches focused on the creek, fueled by speculation that one sister might have slipped into the water and the other tried to save her. But the creek in June was shallow, barely 3 feet deep, and no one believed 2 healthy women could drown there. The banks showed no signs of struggle. No personal belongings were recovered, and even the tracking dogs brought in from the county seat lost the sisters' trail at a logging road about half a mile from the farmhouse. Virginia Ashcroft, bedridden with what her husband described as nervous exhaustion, was never interviewed by investigators. At the time, few questioned that choice. But in later years, her silence became a troubling gap in the case. By early July, the disappearance was no longer front-page news, and many accepted Dr. Ashcroft's suggestion that his daughters had left on their own, perhaps to start fresh in a city or even head west to California. He even told the sheriff that he found some of their belongings missing, as if they had packed. To most of Riverbrook, it was a reasonable explanation in an era when many young people were abandoning rural towns. Yet details refused to fit. Neither Eleanor nor Margaret withdrew money from their bank accounts. No train station within 50 miles reported selling tickets to women matching their description. And most puzzling of all, neither picked up the mail order packages they had been eagerly awaiting, which still sat at the post office days after they vanished. Despite these questions, Riverbrook carried on. For the next 2 years, Dr. Ashcroft kept practicing medicine, though he became increasingly selective about which patients he would see. While Virginia remained hidden from public view, rarely glimpsed outside her home. In September of 1923, the Ashcrofts sold their home and left Riverbrook telling neighbors they were moving to Arizona for the sake of Virginia's health. The farmhouse sat vacant for nearly a year before it was bought by the Johnston family, who lived there until 1958. The story of the missing sisters might have faded completely into memory, if not for a violent storm in April of 1967. That storm toppled one of the ancient elm trees on the property near the eastern edge, about 200 yards from the main house. While clearing the wreckage, the new owner, Mr. Davis, uncovered what looked like human bones tangled in the roots. Sheriff Walter Puig's report filed on April 17th described skeletal remains buried alongside fragments of fabric that matched women's clothing from the early 1920s. A forensic examination determined the bones belonged to at least one woman in her late 20s. The cause of death could not be pinned down, though the medical examiner noted strange markings on the neck vertebrae that suggested strangulation. More unsettling than the bones was a small corroded metal box buried nearby. Inside was a ruined journal, most of its pages lost to time, but a few haunting fragments survived. The handwriting neighbors confirmed was Eleanor Ashcroft's. One entry dated May 3, 1921 read, "Mother grows weaker each day. Father insists the new treatment will work, but I fear the worst. The basement room is prepared. Margaret does not yet know. I cannot bear to tell her what I hear at night." Another surviving note from June the 1st read, "The sounds from below are unbearable. Father says it is necessary that Mother must be kept in complete isolation. Margaret has started to question things. I say nothing, but she notices the locked door, the trays of food that come back untouched." The final entry, written on June 15th, just 2 days before the disappearance, declared, "I found the key. Tonight, while Father is away, Margaret and I will see for ourselves. Whatever is happening in that room must end." These chilling fragments reignited the case and shifted the town's understanding of what had really happened in 1921. Investigators learned that Thomas Ashcroft had died in Phoenix in 1946, but no trace of Virginia could be found after their departure. Even more disturbing, officials discovered Thomas's medical credentials had never been verified. When the basement was examined in 1977, they found a hidden room with bolt locks on the outside, and walls once lined with padded material that had long since decayed. Former neighbors, including Meredith Wilson, recalled how Virginia had begun acting strangely in late 1920, and Thomas explained it away as female hysteria, insisting only he could care for her properly at home. After February of 1921, no one in Riverbrook ever saw Virginia Ashcroft again. Though Thomas assured neighbors she was slowly recovering under his constant supervision. Decades later, in 1967, investigators tracked down Harold Jenkins, who had briefly worked as Thomas's assistant in the early months of that year. His statement painted a troubling picture. He recalled how the doctor guarded his wife's condition with secrecy and mixed strange compounds in the back room, substances Jenkins had never seen used in ordinary medical practice. Once, Jenkins heard glass vials clinking inside the doctor's bag, and when he commented on it, Thomas became furious and dismissed him the following week without explanation. Despite the journal fragments and skeletal remains, investigators could not determine whether the bones belonged to Eleanor or Margaret, nor could they find any trace of the second sister. The case was officially closed as unsolved, classified as a suspected homicide with no possibility of prosecution, since every key figure was presumed dead. What really happened inside that farmhouse during the spring of 1921 remains a mystery. In 1968, criminologist Dr. Rebecca Hayes published an analysis titled "Domestic Shadows: Hidden Crimes of Rural America," where she proposed a disturbing theory. Hayes suggested that Virginia may have been genuinely ill, and that Thomas, desperate to cure her, resorted to experimental treatments in the hidden basement room, which gradually transformed into a prison. When the sisters discovered the truth, they likely threatened to expose him, shattering his authority as both a husband and a physician. Hayes argued that Thomas's professional identity was bound to his success in treating his wife. And when conventional medicine failed, he turned to extreme measures, perhaps influenced by the controversial psychiatric practices of the era. The journal entries imply Virginia was still alive in June, suffering in that basement. But what followed is unclear. Some believe Thomas killed Eleanor, the journal's author, and forced Margaret to help bury her before eliminating her as well. Others suggest he convinced Margaret that Eleanor's death was accidental, manipulating her until they left Riverbrook, where she too disappeared. The Ashcroft case reveals how easily rural isolation could mask horror in a community where a doctor's word went unquestioned, where women's illnesses were dismissed as hysteria, and where the disappearance of two grown sisters could be explained away as them leaving for a better life. The truth was buried for decades, both literally and figuratively. After the storm of 1967 unearthed the remains, the property changed hands several times. But no family lasted more than a few years. In 1972, after repeated failures to sell, the house was demolished. Today the land remains empty, an unmarked scar in a town that has grown around it, a silent reminder of a mystery that Riverbrook has never truly shaken. In 1969, a memorial stone was placed in Riverbrook Cemetery for Eleanor and Margaret Ashcroft, though no remains were ever laid to rest beneath it. Locals still leave flowers from time to time, a quiet act of remorse for the community's failure to protect two of its own. The most unsettling element of the case is not what we know, but what remains unknown. The missing pages of Eleanor's journal, the fate of Virginia, the sisters' final moments. All of it lost to time, buried as surely as the bones beneath the elm tree. In the closing pages of her analysis, Rebecca Hayes offered a grim reflection. The walls of the Ashcroft home hid secrets the community chose not to see. And it was this willful blindness, this preference for simple explanations over the possibility of horror next door, that allowed Thomas Ashcroft to get away with murder. The case files, including photographs of the remains and the surviving journal entries, were archived in the Oklahoma State Police records in 1968. But a fire the following year destroyed most of the material, leaving only a handful of photocopies. Dr. Holloway's manuscript, which contained the most detailed collection of witness statements, never saw publication after his sudden death in 1964. and his research notes donated to the University of Oklahoma were reportedly misplaced during a department move in 1965. This repeated vanishing of evidence has fueled whispers that the truth was deliberately obscured, though no proof of conspiracy has ever been uncovered. What is certain is painfully little. 2 women disappeared in 1921. Human remains surfaced in 1977. A journal pointed to horrors inside the farmhouse, and a doctor with questionable credentials built a prison within his own home. Riverbrook itself has since been absorbed into a larger neighboring city, and most residents today have no memory of the Ashcroft Sisters. The elm grove that once shrouded the house has been cleared for development. Yet one patch of land remains stubbornly undeveloped, plagued by failed construction attempts. In 1968, not long after the storm that reopened the case, an elderly woman appeared at Riverbrook Cemetery. She placed flowers at the new memorial stone, then set down a tarnished house key before quietly leaving. The groundskeeper, unsettled, reported her license plate, which led to a Margaret Johnson of Amarillo, Texas. When investigators arrived, they found the house empty. Neighbors said an older woman had lived there briefly, but left suddenly without notice. Some wondered if this woman had been Margaret Ashcroft, somehow surviving the events of 1921 under a new identity, living for decades, with the unbearable knowledge of what happened to her sister and mother. That possibility that one of the sisters may have lived in silence while carrying the weight of that secret lingers as the darkest shadow in a case already steeped in tragedy. If the woman at the cemetery in 1968 truly was Margaret Ashcroft, what compelled her to return after nearly half a century of silence? And why did she vanish again so quickly? With no answers, the case endures as a cautionary tale of the darkness that can hide behind respectable facades. Thomas Ashcroft was seen as a pillar of Riverbrook, the town's only physician, a man entrusted with lives and respected without question. That such a figure could have imprisoned and likely murdered members of his own family while preserving his reputation illustrates the dangerous power of authority and isolation. Those who lived in the house after the Ashcrofts spoke of an atmosphere that was never right. Martha Johnston, who resided there from 1924 until 1958, later told investigators that certain areas of the property, especially the basement and the eastern edge of the land, felt unnaturally cold, even in summer. She described recurring nightmares in which a silent woman stood at the foot of her bed. While some might dismiss these experiences as suggestion born of the property's grim reputation, the fact that multiple residents reported similar sensations cannot be ignored. The Davis family, who uncovered the remains in 1967, confessed that they had already decided to sell the place before the storm, citing sleepless nights and a suffocating heaviness that hung over the home. The elm tree that concealed Eleanor Ashcroft's body for 46 years was determined to be about 40 years old when it fell, suggesting it had been planted not long after her burial, possibly by Thomas himself, as both marker and disguise. Its location far from the house, but still on the property, indicated planning, not panic. The shallow grave pointed to haste, yet the presence of Eleanor's journal alongside the body raised unsettling questions. Had Thomas overlooked it, or had he assumed time and decay would erase its words forever? The reconstruction, most widely accepted, shaped by Dr. Hayes's analysis and Sheriff Pwitt's findings, paints a grim timeline. In late 1920, Virginia began showing signs of illness or decline, whether real or induced by her husband's treatments. Thomas, clinging to his role as healer, confined her in a padded basement room under the guise of medical necessity. As weeks stretched into months, with no sign of improvement, Eleanor grew suspicious. She began documenting her fears in her journal, and by June of 1921, she and Margaret resolved to uncover the truth. On June 17th, they likely confronted their father. And in the chaos that followed, Eleanor was killed. Whether by intent or accident is unknowable. Thomas buried her beneath the elm and secured Margaret's silence through fear manipulation or threats of exposure. For 2 years he maintained his practice and outward normalcy, keeping Margaret under control until the family abruptly left Riverbrook in 1923. Virginia, whether dead from illness, mistreatment, or outright murder, was gone by then. Margaret either escaped later to reinvent herself under a new name or remained with her father until his death in 1946. The gaps are many. The missing body of Virginia, the unanswered question of Eleanor's final moments, and Margaret's ultimate fate. But the horror remains clear. The Ashcroft case stands as a reminder of how women in early 20th century rural America lived with few defenses. Financial dependence, limited social systems, and a culture that entrusted medical authority almost entirely to men like Thomas left them vulnerable to abuse. Riverbrook, though not willfully cruel, failed them all the same by looking away when signs of trouble appeared. The story of the Ashcroft Sisters is not unique, but its legacy endures as a shadow over what was once a quiet town. Other cases from the same era echo the same grim themes: the Baxter family in Maine in 1924, the Wythe disappearances in Missouri in 1919, the Caldwell Sanitarium scandal in upstate New York in 1922. Each shares the same elements: isolation, confinement, justified by claims of medical or psychiatric necessity, and the unchecked power of men over the women in their care. Yet what makes the Ashcroft case stand apart is the possibility, however faint, that one sister may have survived. If the woman who appeared at the cemetery in 1968 truly was Margaret Ashcroft, she would have been 73, an entirely plausible age. Her re-emergence followed almost immediately by her disappearance hints, either at a deliberate attempt to protect her identity or at outside interference meant to ensure the case remained unresolved. The land where the Ashcroft farmhouse once stood remains conspicuously vacant even now, an open scar in an otherwise developed neighborhood. In 1973, a plan to build a small park on the site was abandoned after repeated equipment failures and accidents among construction workers. Whether coincidence or something darker, the events only deepened the property's reputation. To historians and criminologists, the Ashcroft case has come to represent the perfect storm of conditions that allow domestic horror to flourish. Rural isolation, medical authority, rigid social constraints on women, and a community too eager to accept convenient explanations rather than confront uncomfortable truths. As Dr. Hayes concluded in her final assessment, what doomed the Ashcroft women was not just one man's cruelty, but an entire system that protected him and silenced them. The most frightening aspect of this case is not that a monster existed, but that the structures of family medicine and community concealed him so well. Sheriff Puig's last note in 1968, scrawled in the margin of the closing report, read simply, "Some doors are better left unopened. God have mercy on their souls." The Ashcroft case lingers as a reminder that the worst horrors are not always violent strangers or fleeting acts of madness, but sustained betrayals within the walls of a home. It forces us to wonder how many other stories like this one played out unseen in places where isolation and authority created the perfect cover for cruelty. The elm trees are gone now, the house demolished, most of the evidence scattered or lost, but something of the case still haunts Riverbrook. Residents avoid the empty lot after dark, parents steer their children away, and visitors to the cemetery sometimes speak of glimpsing an elderly woman at the memorial stone standing silently until she fades from view. Whether these sightings are real or simply the echoes of collective memory is impossible to know. What is certain is this: on a hot June evening in 1921, the Ashcroft sisters vanished. One was buried beneath a tree, planted to hide her grave. The other slipped into silence, perhaps surviving long enough to mourn in secret before disappearing once more. Their mother's fate is still a mystery. And the man who likely orchestrated it all, Dr. Thomas Ashcroft, lived out his days in freedom, carrying to his grave the full extent of the secrets hidden in that farmhouse. In 1961, 5 years before the storm that would expose Eleanor Ashcroft's remains, a journalism student from the University of Oklahoma named Robert Chambers passed through Riverbrook while researching small-town histories. Among those he interviewed was Edith Miller, the 83-year-old widow of Sheriff Miller, the man who had overseen the original disappearance. In notes later found among Dr. Holloway's papers, Chambers recorded a chilling recollection. Mrs. Miller claimed that on the night the sisters vanished, her husband returned home after midnight, pale and shaken. He told her he had gone back to the Ashcroft house to press Dr. Ashcroft for more details. Approaching the property, he noticed all the lights were out, except one faint glow in the basement. Peering through the small ground-level window, he saw the doctor kneeling on the floor, scrubbing at something. When he knocked, Thomas answered the front door in different clothes, his hands raw and red as though scoured with lye. Sheriff Miller never wrote this in his report. He told his wife he had no proof, only a deep sense that something was wrong. This uncorroborated account dismissed as hearsay when investigators revisited the case in 1967, nevertheless casts suspicion on Thomas from the very first night. Another detail emerged in 1965 when renovations at the Riverbrook post office revealed a lost envelope wedged behind a sorting cabinet. It was addressed to the Oklahoma State Medical Board, postmarked June 16, 1921, and bore Eleanor Ashcroft's name as the sender. The letter itself was missing, but the envelope suggests Eleanor was attempting to alert authorities, perhaps about her father's questionable treatments of her mother. If Thomas intercepted it or discovered her intent, the timing could explain the violence that followed the next day. Banking records uncovered in 1967 deepened the mystery. In the spring of 1921, Thomas withdrew large sums of cash from the Riverbrook Bank, never redeposited elsewhere. Some theorized he was preparing for flight, others that he was acquiring supplies for treatments he did not want linked to his practice. Adding weight to suspicions was the statement of Joseph Blackwood, a former railroad worker at Milford Junction, 20 miles away. Interviewed in 1967, he recalled seeing a man resembling Thomas in late June 1921, accompanied by a woman who seemed sedated or gravely ill. He claimed the man told him she was his sister with tuberculosis bound for a sanitarium in Colorado. Yet he kept such a tight grip on her arm and blocked anyone from approaching that Blackwood felt uneasy. If true, this sighting suggests Margaret's fate diverged from her sister's, that she was forced to accompany her father in a staged attempt to show the sisters had left town. Where she went after remains unknown. In March of 1968, investigators uncovered another tantalizing lead when they located Irene Foster, a nurse who once worked at a private sanitarium in Flagstaff, Arizona. She recalled a doctor matching Thomas's description, admitting a female patient there in late 1923. The patient Irene Foster remembered as Margaret Johnson was described as catatonic, sunk deep into melancholia. What struck her most was the attention the doctor gave her. He came nearly every day, an unusual devotion since most patients were simply abandoned by families who left them in institutional care. He would sit at her bedside for hours, sometimes silent, sometimes whispering, and whenever Foster entered the room, he grew agitated, ordering her out at once. After 2 months, his visits abruptly stopped, and soon after the woman was transferred to another facility. Foster never learned where. If this Margaret Johnson was truly Margaret Ashcroft, then she had survived at least 2 years beyond her sister's disappearance. her life reduced to a state of psychological captivity under her father's control. And if she was also the Margaret Johnson who appeared at the cemetery in 1968, it would mean she had somehow broken free, rebuilt a life under another name, and carried her secret in silence for decades. The truth of this lead is forever obscured by the 1937 fire that destroyed the Flagstaff Sanitarium's transfer records. What investigators did confirm was that a man calling himself Thomas Johnson, fitting Ashcroft's description, briefly practiced medicine in Flagstaff in 1923 before relocating to Phoenix in 1924. Another unsettling detail surfaced in 1968 from Richard Davis, the man who had uncovered the remains a year earlier. In a follow-up interview, he recalled something he had initially dismissed. When he and his wife first moved into the Ashcroft house in 1965, they discovered a small glass vial hidden behind a loose brick in the basement wall. It contained a clear liquid that had mostly evaporated, leaving only a crystalline residue. Assuming it was nothing, Davis had thrown it away. Forensic experts later suggested the residue might have been morphine or another opiate, a drug often used in the 1920s to pacify psychiatric patients. Others speculated it could have been one of the experimental compounds circulating in early psychiatric practice, many of them later condemned as dangerous. The discovery lent weight to the theory that Thomas was actively medicating, perhaps even poisoning Virginia, worsening the very condition he claimed to be treating. The fact that he concealed the vial hinted he knew his methods could not survive professional scrutiny. When the basement was examined in 1967, investigators found evidence of its disturbing purpose. Though most of the padding had rotted, scraps of quilted fabric and insulation remained clearly intended to smother sound. The doorframe still bore marks of heavy locks bolted from the outside. Small holes drilled high along the walls suggested that restraints may once have been fixed there. When a portion of the concrete floor was removed, investigators uncovered dark stains that analysis confirmed were consistent with blood, though too old to trace. All of it pointed to a grim conclusion: the basement had not been a place of treatment at all, but a chamber of confinement. These findings revealed a basement not as a place of treatment, but as a prison disguised under medical pretense, a room meant to silence and restrain rather than heal. Whether its primary captive was Virginia, as Eleanor's journal suggested, or later one or both sisters, remained speculation. In October of 1968, yet another disturbing lead surfaced when an antique dealer in Phoenix contacted Oklahoma authorities. He had purchased the contents of a storage unit abandoned after the death of its renter, a Thomas Johnson, in 1946. Inside was a worn leather medical bag containing several journals. One dating from 1920 to 1923 appeared to be a treatment log for a patient referred to only as VA. The early entries read with clinical detachment, describing a nervous condition that worsened in spite of repeated interventions. But the later pages grew erratic, the tone personal and bitter, as if the doctors saw the illness itself as a direct insult to his abilities. The final entries in May 1921 were chilling. Patient resists. All conventional treatments, more aggressive approach necessary. Complete isolation, advanced therapeutic regimen. To begin tomorrow will not be defeated by her weakness. The last page, dated June 18, 1921, just a day after the sisters vanished, contained only one line: all obstacles removed, treatment can now proceed without interruption. Handwriting experts confirmed the journal matched Thomas Ashcroft's writing from his official statements in 1921, providing the most damning evidence yet of his descent into obsession and possible madness. The antique dealer also uncovered a bundle of photographs spanning the years 1923 to 1946, many showing a young woman resembling Margaret Ashcroft in different locations across the American Southwest. In several, she looked healthy, smiling even sometimes in the company of others, suggesting she had lived some semblance of a normal life. Investigators speculated that Margaret may have been coerced into leaving Riverbrook with her father, manipulated, drugged, or threatened into compliance, her captivity shifting over time into something more complex. Some suggested she had fallen into a form of Stockholm syndrome, gradually accommodating to her father's control, while publicly assuming the role of his daughter or sister, under the name Margaret Johnson. After his death in 1946, she may have finally found independence, living quietly under her assumed identity, until her mysterious appearance at the cemetery in 1968. If so, her presence at the memorial stone could have been a final act of mourning and attempted closure, a brief step back into the shadows of her past, before vanishing again. When the case was formally closed in December 1968, the official record concluded with the presumption that all central figures were deceased. But the haunting possibility remains that one survivor lived on for decades, burdened by silence and secrets too heavy to share. Sheriff Puig's final report closed with a grim but cautious statement, while substantial circumstantial evidence pointed to criminal activity on the part of Dr. Thomas Ashcroft. In the disappearance and probable death of Eleanor Ashcroft, as well as in the questionable treatment of Virginia Ashcroft, the lack of definitive forensic proof made it impossible to determine the full extent of his crimes. The potential survival of Margaret, perhaps living under the name Margaret Johnson, remained a compelling but unproven theory. Unless new evidence surfaced or Margaret herself came forward, the department considered the investigation closed. Yet the case refused to fade entirely. It lingered in academic studies of historical crime and in the uneasy memory of the region. In 1978, criminologist Edward Blackwell devoted a chapter of his book, The Doctor's Daughter's Medicine and Murder in Rural America, to the Ashcroft mystery, comparing Thomas to other physicians who exploited their authority in remote communities. Blackwell argued that the timing of the case was crucial. The early 1920s were a transitional period in psychiatry, when older methods of moral therapy were being replaced by invasive biological interventions, hydrotherapy, insulin shock. Even crude psychosurgery, many introduced with little proof and no oversight in rural areas. A physician like Ashcroft, practicing without peer review, and with his own wife's decline threatening his reputation, would have been sorely tempted to experiment, however recklessly. Blackwell also placed the case within the wider turmoil of the time. America was staggering from the aftershocks of the First World War, the devastation of the Spanish flu, and the social upheavals of the early 20s. In rural Oklahoma, a doctor's word carried unquestioned weight, and few had the will to challenge him. Most damningly, the sisters disappeared only weeks after the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, an atrocity that consumed the attention and resources of law enforcement across the region. Sheriff Miller himself had been called to assist in Tulsa, perhaps explaining why his investigation into the sisters' disappearance was so limited. Still, the land where the Ashcroft farmhouse once stood remained restless. In 1982, when construction crews finally began preparing the long vacant property for development, they uncovered yet another disturbing discovery. In 1982, when crews broke ground for a new foundation on the long-abandoned Ashcroft property, they uncovered a small metal container buried 4 feet below the soil near where the farmhouse once stood. Inside were personal belongings, a silver hairbrush engraved with the initials VA, a wedding band, and several pages from what appeared to be a journal. Most of the writing had been destroyed by Marshall, but one fragment remained legible. What cannot continue this way? The treatments grow worse. He believes he can cure me, but I fear what he's becoming. If anyone finds this, please know. The passage, though incomplete, suggested that Virginia herself had attempted to leave behind a record of her suffering, perhaps anticipating that she would never be able to speak openly. The deliberate depth of the burial implied she had either convinced someone to hide it for her, possibly one of her daughters, or managed it herself during a fleeting moment of freedom. Though this discovery briefly reignited public interest, it offered little new proof, and the construction company soon abandoned the project, officially citing financial issues. Local whispers, however, claimed the workmen refused to return after a rash of unexplained accidents and machinery failures on the site. In 1994, historian Mariah Holloway, daughter of Dr. James Holloway, published her father's unfinished manuscript along with her own research under the title Forgotten Tragedies: The Lost History of Rural Oklahoma. It became the most comprehensive account of the Ashcroft case, including never-before-seen notes and interviews. Among them was a chilling 1962 interview with Catherine Lewis, who had briefly worked as a housekeeper in the Ashcroft home in early 1921. Lewis recalled that Dr. Ashcroft would often lock himself in the basement with his wife, during which she could hear Virginia crying, pleading for him to stop. On one occasion, Lewis saw her afterward pale as death and barely able to stand, strange marks visible on her arms. When she asked Eleanor about it, the young woman whispered that her father knew best, but her hands trembled as she said it. Lewis also remembered hearing sharp arguments between Eleanor and her father in the weeks before the disappearance. Eleanor accused him of torture, not treatment, and he retorted that she lacked understanding of medicine and must hold her tongue. Afterward, he began locking both his office and the medicine cabinet, even when at home, suggesting he knew his daughter's doubts were growing. This testimony reinforced the idea that Eleanor had been planning to intervene, and that Thomas had already taken steps to protect his control. The mystery deepened further in 2003, when the Riverbrook Historical Society received an anonymous package containing a leather-bound journal and a typed note that read only, "The final testament of Margaret Ashcroft Johnson, to be opened 50 years after my death." Forensic experts confirmed that the donated journal was from the 1920s, though the authenticity of its contents could never be proven beyond doubt. The entries began in 1921, written in a voice that matched what investigators long suspected: Margaret's growing unease with her mother's decline and her father's increasingly volatile behavior. The pages supported the darkest theories. Virginia was being kept in the basement, strapped down, and subjected to treatments that seemed only to hasten her collapse. Eleanor had uncovered records of these procedures and was preparing to alert medical authorities, and together, the sisters planned to enter the basement during their father's absence. The entry, dated June 17, 1921, recounted in harrowing detail the night of their disappearance. Margaret described finding their mother barely conscious, her arms marked by injections, her body frail and wasted. As Eleanor tried to free her, Thomas returned. Enraged, he struck Eleanor with a heavy object, her blood spreading across the wall as Virginia screamed. He told Margaret her sister was dead and that the blame would fall on her. No one would believe her, he said, if she spoke. He forced her to help bury Eleanor beneath the elm tree, warning that if she ever revealed the truth, she would endure the same torment as her mother. The journal continued with details of Thomas's control, how he compelled Margaret to send staged letters from nearby towns, creating the illusion that the sisters had left for California. He kept Virginia sedated, and in 1923 moved her under an assumed name to a sanitarium in Arizona, where Margaret believed she died 2 years later, though she was never permitted to see the body. For decades, Thomas maintained his grip through threats, manipulation, and drugs, reinventing them as Thomas and Margaret Johnson, with her identity shifting from daughter to sister to niece as needed. After his death in 1946, Margaret slowly built an independent life. But her writing revealed relentless nightmares, fear of exposure, and a crushing guilt for her silence. In her final entries from 1968, she described reading of the new memorial stone in Riverbrook and traveling back to leave the key to the basement room beside the flowers, a symbolic act of closure. When she was recognized at the cemetery, she fled once again, settling in a small town in New Mexico under yet another name. The journal's closing page carried her most painful confession. I have carried this burden for nearly 50 years. I was too young, too afraid to stand against my father when it mattered. By the time I found the courage, it was too late for Eleanor. And for Mother. I have lived with their ghosts every day since. I leave this record not to excuse my complicity, but to give them the justice they were denied in life. May God forgive me for my silence. Eleanor, Mother, I am sorry. Those were the final words in the donated journal, a confession that may have been Margaret Ashcroft's last attempt at peace. Its authenticity has never been conclusively proven, and some skeptics have argued it could be an elaborate hoax. Yet handwriting analysis revealed striking similarities to Margaret's few surviving samples from before 1921. And several details within the text matched evidence never made public lending weight to its credibility. If genuine, the journal stands as the most complete account of what happened in the Ashcroft household, confirming theories investigators had pieced together in the 1960s. It did not portray Thomas Ashcroft as a deliberate monster, but rather as a man consumed by professional arrogance, unable to face the humiliation of failure and spiraling into obsession until his determination to cure his wife destroyed his entire family. The journal also offered rare insight into Margaret's survival, showing how she compartmentalized her trauma, built a new identity, and lived in silence for decades before entrusting her testimony to history. Her decision to have it revealed only after her death suggested both a desire for truth and a lasting fear of exposure. In 2012, archaeologists conducted a ground-penetrating radar survey of the former Ashcroft property as part of a regional study. Several anomalies were detected, areas where the soil showed signs of disturbance, far from the elm tree that had concealed Eleanor's partial remains. Excavation of one such spot yielded fragments of fabric and a tarnished silver locket containing a faded photograph of Virginia and her daughters, but no human remains. The discovery raised the possibility that Virginia too had been buried on the land, though the journal's account that she died in Arizona remains equally plausible. Today, more than a century after the sisters vanished, the Ashcroft case endures because it embodies how power isolation and social norms can create perfect conditions for hidden horror. In a community where a doctor's word was rarely questioned, where women's illnesses were dismissed as hysteria, and where family matters were deemed private, Thomas Ashcroft wielded unchecked authority to imprison, experiment on, and ultimately destroy his family, while maintaining a facade of respectability. The story also underscores how trauma echoes through generations. The lot where the house once stood remains conspicuously empty, despite being surrounded by modern homes and businesses, a silent scar on the landscape. Locals still speak of cold drafts of unease that settles over them as they pass, of a heaviness that lingers in the air. Whether these sensations are superstition or something more, they reflect the way tragedy has imprinted itself on the community's memory. For criminologists and historians, the Ashcroft case remains a crucial example of how domestic abuse and medical misconduct were able to flourish in early 20th century America, particularly in rural settings. It continues to inform studies of historical crime and the failures of oversight. As Dr. Rebecca Hayes concluded in her final analysis, the true tragedy of the Ashcroft women lies not only in what they endured, but in how easily it could have been prevented if their community had dared to look beyond appearances. Every society creates blind spots, places we choose not to examine too closely, because doing so would challenge the foundations of trust we place in people and institutions. The Ashcroft case is a stark reminder of what can hide in those blind spots, and how our refusal to see can make us complicit in horrors unfolding in plain sight. The ultimate fate of Margaret Ashcroft, if she was truly the author of the donated journal, remains a mystery. Her directive that it remains sealed for 50 years after her death suggests she may have passed away in the early 2000s, with the account not to be made public until around 2050. Whether that instruction will be honored, or whether future investigation might uncover more of her life, remains unknown. What is certain is that on a hot June evening in 1921, something terrible took place inside the Ashcroft home. Eleanor was struck down and buried beneath an elm tree, her remains hidden for decades until chance revealed them. Margaret vanished into silence, perhaps living the rest of her life under false names, burdened by secrets she could never share. Virginia disappeared months earlier, her fate a matter of speculation whether she died on the property or in a distant sanitarium. And Thomas Ashcroft, once a respected physician, descended gradually into obsession and violence, unnoticed by those around him, until it was far too late. The vacant lot where the farmhouse once stood still endures a scar on the landscape and a reminder of what happens when authority is left unchecked. When women's voices are dismissed, and when communities choose comforting lies over painful truths. In Oklahoma's records, the Ashcroft case remains unsolved. In the hearts of those who know its details, the truth feels clear, though justice was never served. Eleanor and Virginia were victims of a man whose pride outweighed their lives. Margaret was both victim and reluctant accomplice, coerced into silence by fear and manipulation. Their story, pieced together from fragments, contradictions, and a century of fading memory, will always be incomplete. And perhaps that is the most disturbing truth of all, that some horrors can never be fully explained, only endured, remembered, and passed on as warning. The shadows of the Ashcroft case stretch across more than a century, a lingering reminder of how easily darkness can thrive behind closed doors, and how ordinary people can conceal extraordinary cruelty. That perhaps is the truest legacy of Eleanor Virginia and Margaret Ashcroft, not merely as victims of a tragedy, but as silent witnesses whose story warns against the dangers of unchecked authority and the devastating cost of indifference. As the sun sets over what was once their home, the empty lot remains a void in the landscape, a place where no one builds, where nothing grows quite right, where even the most skeptical admit to feeling watched. Some call it suggestion, the mind's instinct to create meaning in shadows, but perhaps in ways beyond explanation, the echo of what happened there persists. It is a reminder that some wounds never heal. Some stories never end, and some silences speak louder than words. The Ashcroft Sisters vanished on a warm June evening in 1921. Their story pieced together only through fragments of evidence, fractured testimonies, and the slow revelations of time. Their fate reminds us that the most terrifying monsters are not supernatural beings, but ordinary men whose darkness goes unchallenged until it is far too late. And most chilling of all, it forces us to wonder how many other stories remain buried, their victims, forgotten, their perpetrators never held to account, as Margaret Ashcroft is said to have written in her final testament. The worst prison is not built of bars and locks, but of silence and fear. I escaped the house, but I never truly left it behind. Some doors once opened can never be closed again.